Well, to discuss the situation in the Strait and Iran further, I'm joined now in the studio by Dania Thafer. She's the Executive Director of the Gulf International Forum, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And in Manchester, I'm joined by Martin Kelly, the Head of Advisory at the EOS Risk Group and a Maritime security analyst. Thank you both for your time today. Dania, I'll start with you. Do you have any hope that this latest proposal, and I'll be very cautious with my words here, is a step forward toward ending the conflict?
I think any engagement could be a step forward, but also, last couple of days I was thinking we're heading towards escalation. So the fact that they did a little bit of a U-turn and went to the negotiation table, I think is something to look at cautiously. I'm not sure about optimistically. Because this has been a roller coaster, as you've seen over the course of the last couple of months. Until we see some sort of handshake, I think we should just look at it and try to understand what are the key terms between both of the parties. It doesn't look like they have broken the key issues, such as will the nuclear issue be talked about up front? Or is this something Iran wants to kick down the road?
Martin, can I bring you in here? Because our US correspondent said that the President, Donald Trump, does still have escalation as an option. Resuming hostile activities on Iran or in the Strait of Hormuz is always an option that he is still considering. Where that is at, we can only guess. But I'm wondering what your biggest concern is at the moment about that situation in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. I agree here. We must be sceptical about the news that any sort of agreement has been reached. I mean, we've been here before where one side publishes news that would suggest an improvement in relations, but then the other side later disputes, or the details that are different to what each other says. There's already discrepancy in the percentage of Iranian funds that are to be released under this new agreement. And so Donald Trump doesn't have many options left. They are either to negotiate or to resume conflicts. And I don't think the latter would have a great deal of support, especially from Gulf states. I think through Iranian resilience and asymmetric warfare, Iran has not only demonstrated that it's got full control of the Strait of Hormuz, but Iran has demonstrated that military escorts are not viable. We saw the relatively short lifespan of Project Freedom. And Iran also shown that weeks of bombardment from the US and Israel is not sufficient to deter Iran or even to degrade Iranian capability. So I think Iran's aim here was to use the Strait of Hormuz as leverage to gain US concessions. And by that logic, it means that probably only diplomacy is the route to progression rather than a return to conflict.
Martin just brought up the word concessions, and there is Iranian media reports out now that the US has agreed to waive oil sanctions while negotiations are ongoing. We saw a previous one-month waiver already. Does this help mediation of a solution, or, can I put it to you, this simply helps finance Iran and allows it to avoid entering negotiations if it is able to have sanctions relief and begin negotiations with other countries or companies that will pay for some kind of security permit through the Strait?
And there's a lot of key questions when it comes to this particular issue. In terms of lifting the sanctions, the U.S. did temporarily lift the sanctions on oil before and confiscated Iranian ships at the same time with oil. And so there's another question is, what about the blockade? Are they lifting the sanctions on oil and keeping the blockade on the oil at the same time? So it's quite unclear what exactly this means, unless they clarify more what exactly they mean in terms of lifting the sanctions.
Just quickly, before I go back to Martin, can you see sense in that strategy? Because I understand you're sort of saying, well, what is the left hand doing, what is the right hand doing? But do you see a reason why this would be beneficial to either party? It is somewhat, it looks like, an olive branch at first, but when we actually look at it, do you see sense in it?
If the U.S. was to lift the blockade off of the oil, coupled with the lifting of the sanctions on the oil, I think you might see some movement in their negotiation process. But without that, it just seems like one kind of X's out
One
the
hand
other.
giveth, the other hand taketh away.
Yeah, so it's not clear at this point.
Martin, can I ask you, you mentioned this before briefly, and I want to dig into it a bit more. All the while, Gulf nations, the neighbours of Iran, are economically stagnating. And I'm wondering, we saw for a little while talk by the US of those escorts, of Project Freedom. Was there a reason why none of those options were realistically viable?
Okay, so there's a number of points in there. The first is, if we look at the volume of attacks against Gulf states, the UAE was hit even harder than Israel. That significantly impacted their economy, and Gulf states are unable to export their oil and gas. Some of the countries have had to declare force majeure because they can't meet the contracts that were previously agreed before the conflict. Now, when we look at escorting through the Strait of Hormuz, this is inherently different to anywhere else in the world. People try to draw comparisons from the tanker wars or from even the recent Red Sea crisis. However, this is completely different. The technology that ships are faced against now in conflict is much more advanced than in the tanker wars. For a ship transiting through the Strait of Hormuz, it's facing UAVs, anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, unmanned surface vessels. These ballistic missiles are traveling at 2 or 3 times the speed of sound. And so to be able to escort a ship whilst under this immense pressure is not really possible. The US put 3 warships through the Strait of Hormuz over last weekend to try and demonstrate navigation of freedom, but they came under intense bombardment, and that was not really sustainable if they were to be in escort with a commercial ship. So it's not really possible, and I think this has been proven over the past week, which has probably shown some sort of encouragement towards negotiations.
Dania, there is also the issue that there are 1,500 vessels that have been in the Strait for some time, 20,000 odd crew aboard those. Whose responsibility is it to ensure their welfare at this point, regardless of who put the blockade in or who removes their foot off the pedal next?
Well, the second part of your question kind of negates the first, regardless of who puts the blockade. No, it matters who puts the blockade because they're blockaded in by that party. So I would say that, you know, right now, since the Iranians have the leverage over the Strait, it should be on the onus should be on the Iranians, at least from a humanitarian side. Prior to this, the U.S.'s main strategy in the Gulf region, and one of its core strategic interests, was securing the waterways, and that is part of the responsibility of the U.S. also in the region. So by the U.S. launching this war, it worked against one of its own core interests.
Right. Dania Thafer joining me in studio, and Martin Kelly joining us from Manchester. Thank you both.